Welcome to Harmony Talk, a podcast about dreamers and doers. We chat with people who pursued and realized their passion from every walk of life: sports, science, industry, the arts, and global innovation. This podcast is brought to you by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. I'm your host, Lisa Champeau. Our guest today is Luana Graves Sellars, a writer, community activist, and cultural influencer who has dedicated her life to promoting and preserving the history of the Gullah Geechee populations in the southeastern United States. To date, she has written close to 100 articles on Gullah families and culture. She founded the Low Country Gullah Foundation, which raises funds to help multi-generational Gullah families keep their land. She also teaches classes on Gullah culture for Osher Lifelong Learning and is the creator and keeper of her website, lowcountrygullah.com, a living, breathing treasure trove of Gullah Geechee traditions in food, arts, crafts, family roots, and religion. While it's focused primarily on Hilton Head Island, Low Country Gullah bridges all of the communities in the Gullah Geechee corridor, which includes the Sea Islands that span from the eastern seaboard to 35 miles inland from Wilmington, North Carolina, to St. Augustine, Florida. Welcome, Luana. So good to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure for me to be here as well.
Now, for people who do not know who the Gullah Geechee people are, where they came from, and their significance in American history, can you just give us an overview?
So the Gullah Geechee are the direct descendants of West African enslaved people who were specifically brought here because they were extraordinarily talented and had incredible knowledge in the art of farming rice from using fresh water and seawater combined. And so they were brought specifically to the Sea Islands for that purpose.
And the Gullah Geechee people have retained many of their traditions here in the United States. In fact, more so than maybe any other African-American population. What are some of those traditions?
Well, the traditions, there's a very long list, but I'll give you just a few. For instance, the fact that the culture is rooted in religion. So the connection to religion and the church is one of the very strong ones that has actually kind of blossomed into Black American culture. So a lot of the traditions that were early Gullah traditions are still there. The food is very significant. Most Gullah families have the majority of their day or some meal within their day having rice-based dishes. And that's because they came from a rice growing culture as far back as West Africa. And there are a lot of other traditions: sweetgrass basket making, net making. The list can go on.
I believe it. I believe it. Now, this is a podcast about dreamers and doers. And I think it's fair to say, Luana, that this was not your original dream in life. You grew up in New York. You went to school in Illinois. You moved to Florida. And then you found yourself on Hilton Head Island. And suddenly you were writing articles about the Gullah Geechee people when a spark was lit. What drove your passion to write and keep writing about these people?
It actually was a converging of two different things. My background educationally, I have a degree in journalism and a degree in Black history. So I've always had that fascination with Black history. Although with my degree, I did not know about the Gullah and the traditions and all of the things that I've written about since I started writing. The other thing was that I grew up in a Gullah household, but I did not know that I was growing up in a Gullah household. So my grandmother always had Carolina rice on the table for every meal. Okra was also a staple with our diet, fish and things like that. So I grew up Gullah, but I did not know that I was Gullah. And I had two aunts who would say that they were Geechees. That's what they call themselves. But they never told me when I was growing up what that meant or what they were talking about. So when I started writing, and it really just started as a freelancing opportunity that I was looking for something to do. And as I was writing about the Gullah, because that's what they specifically asked me to do, while I was doing that and writing some of the stories about the first families, one of the people in one of the families said, well, when are you going to do your own story? And because I had already done a lot of genealogy work on my family, everything just kind of collided and turned into this thing that has grown out of Low Country Gullah.
I have a couple of questions here. First of all, what's the difference between Gullah and Geechee?
Well, there's no short answer for that. Because Gullah is a face-to-face oral traditional culture, it's kind of like playing phone tag. So the story probably has gotten muddied throughout the generations. But the short answer is, in the technical sense, the Gullah are the North Carolina, South Carolina, and the Geechee are the Georgia, Florida. But there were tribes in Africa, the Gullah tribe, the Gullah tribe, the Geechee tribe. So those words could be derivatives of that. And Angola was the largest country that enslaved people came out of. And so because of the similarity to the word Angola, it's kind of a mishmash of all of those things.
I didn't realize Angola was the most populous country for slaves. I thought it was Ghana. No, it's Angola.
Actually, Angola was about 42% of the enslaved people that came out of West Africa came from Angola. And that was actually the first country that the Portuguese pulled people out of.
You found out about your own history after developing this sort of passion for writing about the Gullah people. And I understand you had an ancestor, a great-grandfather, who was a freed slave or an escaped slave and was in the colored troops. Tell us about that. That's a fascinating story.
So my daughter had asked to kind of dive into our genealogy, probably at least 20 years by now ago. So I always knew who my grandmother's great grandfather was, and that his name was Caesar Ravenel. But until that person asked me to start working on my own story, I did not know a lot about him. Only the general fact that he was from Charleston. And my grandmother was born in Charleston and her sisters. So that much I knew. But when I started doing the research that I've been doing, what I uncovered was that not only did he join the Union colored troops in Beaufort, South Carolina, he was also in one of the regiments that was on Hilton Head. And I had moved to Hilton Head, but didn't know that connection until years after I had been here and doing the work that I'm doing. And that just took me into what I call a rabbit hole of discovery.
I bet. What a revelation.
Oh, absolutely. On who he was, what he did, his time in the military, and then fascination on a lot of the other soldiers that were either enslaved and brought into the Union Army or those that decided to join up. And what I found is that Hilton Head, because of its historic history of having the Union Army based here, that this place was more significant of a place than I had really imagined.
Well, tell me a little bit about the colored troops, because I think your production company, you actually produced a video about them. So let's dive into the colored troops for a minute. You know, who were they? What did they accomplish? I understand some of them were under General Montgomery. Somehow Harriet Tubman is involved in this. You're talking about a rabbit hole, right? But what a lovely rabbit hole.
It is a lovely rabbit hole. And I have to say today, this morning, I woke up to an email nominating me for my Colored Troops documentary in a film festival in Rome. So I'm still floating on that high. And so my film has gone international. I do have one on Harriet Tubman as well, because she was also on Hilton Head for about 8 months. But because the Union Army was here, they started taking over the Sea Islands strategically because it was sandwiched between Savannah and Charleston. And so because they were here, the white slave owners and whoever was on the Sea Islands, they all ran away. The Confederates, they all left the islands and they essentially left the enslaved people here. And so because the enslaved were here and the Union Army moved in, they were automatically freed to do as they pleased. because the Army at that point needed reinforcements, they started essentially freeing enslaved people and then enlisting enslaved people. And because they didn't have what was called a political status, they were considered as contraband of war. And so as the Army went through the South, they started bringing Union soldiers into the ranks so that they would bolster their numbers. And so that's really how the colored troops started to become the fighting force that they did.
Did they freely enlist?
Some did. There were a lot of men who were free and in the North who freely enlisted. There were some who ran away and enlisted. And then there were some that were emancipated. And then they essentially went from farmers or whatever they were doing as an enslaved person to soldier within a day. Whatever they had in their hands, if it was shovel or hoe or whatever, they took that out and put a rifle in their hand and said, okay, we're going to fight. So a lot of missing training, a lot of used equipment went into that, but they took what they had and they made the best of what they had. And they really were instrumental in turning the tide of the war towards the Union's victory.
How many soldiers are we talking about in the colored regiments? And there must have been a lot of sacrifices.
Yes, there was close to 170,000 that were in the Army. It's a huge number. And they were also in the Navy. The Navy also included them into their ranks. And I have to say that even though eventually the government chose to keep the Union soldiers, they still had a lot of things that they faced. They faced racism. Like I said, they were given hand-me-down clothes and weapons and things like that. So there were a lot of issues that came along with that, misfires and injuries and so on. But regardless of what they were facing, they made the best of what they had. They were very loyal and very dedicated fighters and had a lot of respect from the hierarchy throughout the Army.
I imagine that finding documents supporting this must have been quite a challenge because not only was it a long time ago, but certainly colored troops, their histories weren't necessarily recorded in depth, I would imagine. So what kind of a challenge was that for you?
Well, the Army, most of the soldiers do have either, I'll use Caesar as an example. I have his pension file, his complete pension file, which includes all of the times that he checked in for service or they took a roll to see if he was in attendance, and a lot of the documentation of what he did. So for most soldiers, that was the case. But unfortunately, the Army was really, I can't say any other way other than cruel in not recognizing a lot of the soldiers. So for instance, a lot of them had to prove how old they were to get a pension. Well, if you were enslaved, those records didn't exist. So a lot of soldiers didn't get pensions. They had to ask for other soldiers to verify that they were soldiers. Some of them had been killed or they scattered after the war. So for a lot of people, it was a really tall fight for them to try and get the money that they were deserved. Even Harriet Tubman, she had trouble getting her pension, and she was a significant part of the Union Army's victory, not only in South Carolina, but also in Jacksonville, Florida, and all the way, between South Carolina and there. And she wound up having to fight for many, many years just to be recognized for the service that she had to the country. So the documents are there to a certain degree, but some may be kind of sketchy and incomplete.
Well, the Gullah people, I believe, were the first slaves or freed slaves to own land. So there was a lot of grit there. There was a lot of determination. And you, as I understand it, your foundation is now trying to help them kind of hold on to that land. Could you tell me a little bit about the foundation?
Absolutely. So when I started Low Country Gullah, I knew that I was doing work to not only educate people, but to also document the culture and to maintain some of the traditions. Because, like I said, they're oral traditions. And as elders are passing away, the stories are passing away. And so I realized very early on that I could not do the culture justice if I was not also preserving the land. And so that's how the foundation was started, because for a lot of Gullah families, they may have had land in their family since the Civil War. And so for 150 some odd years, the land has been passed down through the family to descendant to descendant to descendant. But because all of the land primarily started out on the Sea Islands, tourism, resort development, all of these other factors have come into play. And because of that, rising taxes come into play, and as well as the issue of what is called heirs property, which is that passing down the land through the generations without documentation. So that's what the foundation does. We help people to, if their taxes have gone up or they're struggling to pay them, we help pay their taxes, as well as with the heirs property issue. We try and educate people and help them unravel the mess that heirs property is, because it can turn into a multi-year struggle to get it ironed out. Because eventually some people, and let's use Caesar as an example, he's got thousands of heirs by now. And so any land would be connected to, by percentage, all of those heirs.
So do you have land there? Have you been able to research that?
I do know that Caesar had about 15 acres in Red Top, South Carolina, which is just outside of Charleston. It is not heirs property, but because of my passion for the culture and my love for the culture, I feel that any Gullah land is my land, and it is my right as a Gullah person to help preserve it, because it is the culture's greatest asset. And that's why it needs to be protected and preserved so that the culture can maintain itself.
Is it not heirs property because it's not around Hilton Head, or why is it different?
First of all, there are 11 states that have heirs property, from North Carolina all the way to Texas. And it's primarily attributed to Black land loss. And close to 90% of any Black land loss in America is attributed to heirs property issues. And the reason behind it is because, think about it, during Jim Crow and all of the Black codes and all of these things, people were not feeling confident in the government, in the judicial system. They lost money through the Freedmen's Bank. There's a whole list of reasons. So they were not getting wills. They did not know how to do it. And to be honest, coming out of the Civil War, the landowners were encouraged to do that kind of land transfer by going family to family member. So it was a situation that was essentially created for them. And now we are living the mess that has created, because there is no documentation. And sometimes people don't even know that they're living on heirs property. They may be living on the heirs property for 80 years or something like that, but they don't know that it is heirs property until something happens, like someone passes away, or there's a conversation about what to do with the land, or they want to build on the land and they go to, say, the town or the county to do something, and they don't have the rightful owner of that property because that person could have passed away 10, 20 years ago. So it's a huge, huge mess, can of worms that exists. It takes a lot of money and time and patience to be able to get it unraveled.
How many families still live in the Gullah area around Hilton Head?
Around Hilton Head, I believe it's about 1,500 individuals on Hilton Head. In the corridor, the Gullah Geechee corridor, which is from Wilmington, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, and about 40 miles inland. Although people are scattered now, because of course, you lose the land and you move outside. But the last count that was taken was about 500,000 people that are still within the corridor of Gullah descent. But again, like I said, people have moved. So the number of Gullah is about 89% of the Black population that can count themselves descendants of enslaved people from those 4 states.
Including yourself, by the way, as someone whose family moved away.
Proudly.
Proudly. There are a lot of streets and highways named after Gullah families around Hilton Head, and you have talked to the first families. Tell us a little bit about that. Who are they?
The first series of articles that I did was on the first families of Hilton Head. And Hilton Head is the home of Mitchellville, which is the first town for freedmen in the United States. Because the Army was here, they were given their own land and able to build out of that. And so 10 surnames came out of Mitchellville that were and still are living on the island. And so that's what the first families was. And so what I was able to do was connect the current family members or descendants of the original people all the way back to the original people. And with that, kind of bridge the story of their beginning and where they are now, and tell the fact that they were able to survive so many different obstacles that were put in front of them and thrive on the island, including some of them still trying to fight for their land.
Mitchellville is a historic site. It's been somewhat preserved. Is that some place that you encourage people to visit?
Absolutely. Everybody needs to come to Mitchellville. And one of the things that, for me, early on, connecting myself to the culture, what I realized is, and I used Mitchellville as someplace tangible that I could say that my family descended from. Because as a child, I did not know, there was no DNA. I didn't know, my connections to Africa or anything like that. But I knew that I could come to Mitchellville, and at least Mitchellville was the beginning of my family story. Whether it was 100% true or 10% true, as a collective story, because a lot of information for African Americans is non-existent, but collectively, if we merge our stories, Mitchellville is the beginning for a lot of us. And so for anybody who is a descendant of an enslaved person, that's something tangible that you can touch and you can go to and you can be a part and experience the land and the story. Of course, now there's DNA and, you can figure out exactly what tribes and what places in Africa that you are descended from. But if you can't even get that far, Mitchellville is a good place to start.
You have won a lot of awards, but I think possibly one of the nicest honors you ever received happened this year. You went to Ghana and you were given a new African name. And I'm going to mess it up, but I'm going to try. Nana Nyakoa. No, you'll have to do it.
It's Nana Nyakoa.
Nana Nyakoa.
Yes.
Which means someone of respect and dignity. And how did you come about getting that name?
Well, I was very fortunate to be a part of a group of about 30 people that went on a slave pilgrimage to Ghana. I am about 10% Ghanaian. I'm more Nigerian, but I have Ghanaian and Senegalese in me. And so it was really a going home for me. And while there, we were able to walk in the footsteps of our ancestors from the inland to the coast and see the experiences that they had to go through. And while I was there, one of the kings who is from the area of Takrady, which is just north of Accra, Ghana, he gave us all names. And he is a Nana. And so Nana is considered as a not only name of respect, but it is also one that is given to royalty that is also coupled with Nakoa, which means dedication and loyalty. And the king gave me this name, this combined name, first of all, after an influential ancestor. So I am renamed after an ancestor, but it is also representative of the work that I do in the culture and the loyalty that I have had to telling the Gullah story. And so I'm very, very honored to have the opportunity to go through the ceremony and have that name given to me.
Well, well-deserved, well-deserved. Congratulations. Kind of coming full circle. Thank you so much for talking with us and filling us in on the Gullah culture and also taking us back to the Civil War and elements of that part of our history that many of us did not know. Thank you so much, Luana. I wish you the best of luck in the future. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
This podcast has been brought to you by AM Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. Thanks for being with us. Talk to you next time.